Okay, well, look, we might kick off. Welcome to this morning's discussion. You've got Ed and myself. The photos might make us look like twins. For those that are interested, I'm the one with a little more hair if I tilt my head down. So we might just kick off with some brief introductions. So I'm Alistair Baron. I look after supply chain at Idoba. Been in the game for 30 odd years. Started as a nice green little graduate in Tom Price back in the last century, which doesn't make us feel old at all, and then had a variety of roles across the supply chain in resourcing over that period of time, from project engineering through construction, through supply chain optimization, running rail operations, looking after airports and towns and the like. So seen a fair bit and have a few scars as well. Ed, how about yourself?
Well, hi everyone. I'm Eduardo, at Adobe, the head of services, which is advisory and solutions. Unlike Alistair, I'm not a man of the Renaissance, but I started my career in mining in the Northern Territory, doing operational excellence, then moved to the dark side of consulting, working in strategy for my entire career, with the exception of a 3-year stint when I ran my own startup. And that's where I really loved the dynamics of product development and technology, and that opened the doors to Idoba, which is the place where we are in now, trying to solve these problems. And thank you everyone for coming through. I see that there was a bit of a problem with the chat function, so I will ask for help for someone to fix. But in the meantime, let's do Q&A as an alternative. And without further ado, let's start. I think, Alistair, would you like to crack on with one of your stories?
Yeah, look, I think one of the keys that we're seeing at the moment with supply chains, and particularly in mining, is in a lot of cases there's a need to make high consequence decisions in short time frames with incomplete information. And perhaps something to make that a little real is, some of you may have been aware of a derailment of a train about 5 years ago. So one of the large mining operations in WA had a situation where a train without a driver started moving of its own accord. At that time, I was in the role looking after the rail operations area, and received a phone call at 5:07 a.m. on a Monday morning. Those of you that have done FIFO recognise that that's about the time where you're just starting to think about work again and making your way to the airport. Effectively, over the space of 10 minutes with very limited information, we got to a situation where there was about 30 seconds to make the decision to derail that train or not. So really no time to escalate. You had information about potential consequences of not derailing the train, which were fairly significant at that time, involving both people and equipment. And literally you're making that decision almost instantaneously. One thing that came through for me at that stage was it would have been really good to have a lot more information to make that decision. The good news is I don't think the decision would have changed. It still would have been the right decision to make to derail that train. But really, without information available locally, for example, on a phone or a laptop, you really are flying blind. So one of the key challenges, and I guess something I've always looked at after that, is how do we get the right information to the right people at the right time to make the right decision? Because it might be 5 o'clock on a Monday morning, where you have to make those high consequence decisions.
Well, Alistair, thank you for the courage to share that story with everyone. And obviously that's a clear impact on safety, so having the right information at the right place at the right time. Normally it's associated with efficiencies, but obviously there's a flip side of that coin, and examples like those ones where it has a very significant safety impact. But going back to the challenges of the industry right now, what do you think from a supply chain perspective? What are the main challenges that you expect mining to be facing in the next 5 years?
Look, I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is community expectation and license to operate is including a lot more factors into the decision making of all the organisations. So initially, a lot of the mining organisations, it was just about tonnes and cost. And that was about maximisation of revenue, and really around, that was predominantly all the shareholders and stakeholders and companies were looking at. And that was fairly easy to solve. You had some local automation, some local optimisation, but the systems were fairly simple, and making decisions was quite quick. And there weren't too many opportunities for the complexity to drive incorrect decisions. What then happened is, I think we saw quality emerge. So all of a sudden you've got three variables, and a lot of companies then recognized the system was becoming a lot more integrated. You were getting more mines bolting into some of the larger systems, and then some of the smaller mines were bolting into large supply chains where they potentially didn't own the infrastructure. One of the solutions that organisations moved to there was to look at remote operation centres, where you managed to get all of the people into the one room or one space, and therefore, as a result of that, you ended up with quite a few of the organisations coming up with technology sitting in operation centres located in capital cities. So moved away from those local control rooms to an integrated operations centre. There was a bit more knowledge, a few more systems, but eventually, you know, a lot of those organisations took that up. I think now, as you start to look at some of those ESG challenges, you look at dust, you look at noise, you look at safety, risk, geopolitical uncertainty, and just the complexity, size and scale of the organisations and the operations that organisations are looking at running now. It's about what's that next operations centre? How do we move past just locating people together? So it's really moving from plan and react to predict and respond. It's taking that decision making from the rules-based perspective into learning-based. It's going from those operation centres integrating the data from those siloed parts of the organisation really to an end-to-end integration. And in many cases, you move from a linear sequential type approach to your supply chain to that dynamic network. I think as you look at the rails, you look at ports, the different products, the quality, looking to manage emissions, dust, noise, deployment of people and resources, you really end up with that dynamic network. So yeah, I think that's a lot of those challenges there.
So, well, thank you, Alistair. I would like to ask the audience if they've got any challenges that they think we haven't reflected. Please put them in the chat. We will love to hear about them. And I will have a question for everyone there. And the question will be, do we think that we have enough information to make the right decisions in our current state of supply chain? Obviously, each person will represent a different organization, but in general, could we significantly improve or not? So,
and I think, look, data and data access is one of the challenges that a lot of the organisations face. I think our environment at times operates on the edge of what technology can deal with, especially in some of the remote mining environments, and particularly in underground environments too. You don't necessarily see that live stream of data available all the time. So it's really about what's the important data, how do you actually get it, and then how do you get it back to the systems to actually assist you in making the correct decisions. But also then you've got security issues around data as well. So in terms of, Eduardo, around some of the physical, practical elements of those challenges, have you got an example where you've seen organisations with those challenges? I know we're part of the Parenti group, and we've certainly got some cases, I'm sure, within Parenti that we've recognised.
Yeah, well, data access is almost it's the number one problem, and the problem that you really need to solve before you can do anything fancy. Obviously, the biggest challenge that you've got underground is that your network coverage is not going to be there. So to have access to that data, you need to incur in an investment to have that network working. Otherwise, you will continue operating blind.
Yeah.
So that's the main challenge that underground operations will face.
Yeah, certainly interested if people have seen solutions in their particular environments. It's often challenging when progress is blowing things up to have technology that doesn't like that type of activity. Providing the network out on the face is challenging. So there's certainly quite a few providers that indicate their solutions will work in that harsh environment. But I think it's safe to say the reliability of the solutions we've seen to date haven't quite been there.
Yeah, everything works in the lab, but not so much in underground mining.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk now about what are some of the solutions out there that will help us in terms of addressing some of those challenges. So I think one of the elements there we've been talking about is data. And I think the other element is around the digital twins, or the tools that sit in the background and use that data to try and provide the insights. So it's really then about how do we go about connecting the real and virtual world together for the best results. How do we go from that plan and react, where it's really, look, here's what we think will happen, and then when things move outside that, we then go and replan, to looking ahead over the horizon and seeing what comes through. The models, AI, we've all heard the catchphrases. Can they actually help us move into that predict and respond phase? And how are the digital twins changing and morphing over time to provide better results? So I think, look, from a maturity perspective, when we look at digital twins, we've got initially, I'm sure most of you, the power of Excel is a wonderful thing. And I'm sure a lot of us have tinkered in Excel and got those Excel-driven insights. I think that's really the first level of digital twins. I think the other one, that when you move to the next stage is where you get to informative and predictive. That's really based around using elements like driver models and relying on that historic data to generate the forecast for the future. And I think, look, machine learning's certainly got a role there, where you've seen similar situations before and you're looking at the patterns. I think now we're starting to look at the fourth level of the digital twin, where it's actually a living digital twin, where you're updating models based on the data flows from site, that real-time data, and then you're turning it into those actionable insights. So I think that's really where we're getting.
So we're going to jump. We've got a question from Oliver saying, generative AI is known for generating content. Is there any drive within mining to create augmented data, i.e. synthetic data from generative AI and real data in addressing lack of data? And how does this contrast with digital twins? So I will answer. So to create dummy data, I think there are many ways to do it. To forecast with generative AI, there are some products already or popping up that work well with time series data, which is what you're talking about here, right? Like, and those are as well the limitations of Excel. Excel is not good at managing time series. So you need tools which are more powerful than that if you want to forecast. So in that sense, yes, there's generative AI that helps predicting time series data, which is effectively the data you've got in mining. Having into that, I wanted to ask you a question, Alistair, because we're talking about forecasting, and you obviously use algorithms to forecast, and those algorithms could be many in many shapes or forms from very different natures, from generative AI to to discrete linear algorithms. But all algorithms have an accuracy attached to it, and in a dynamic environment, that accuracy changes. And in my experience, normally when an automation doesn't work, is because every operator, every user of that forecast expects it to work at 100% accuracy all the time. So then if it doesn't work once, the system gets ruled out and said, oh, this system doesn't work. So how do you think we can address that problem? Because the human side of trusting these models, it's a big issue, traditionally.
Yeah, look, and I think it's an area, it's around building up that truth network, or that truth pathway with any of the models that you look to implement. So it's about understanding the limitations of the technique that you're using to forecast. And part of that is in the original discovery phase, looking at the problem, you actually work through, okay, here's the data we've got, here's the technique we're selecting and why, and therefore here's the limitations of it. So we then start to be able to highlight a confidence level around that forecast. And that's certainly what we look to do when we're making those predictions, is provide a confidence window or pathway for that particular information. Because you're absolutely right, the patterns that it's looked at, and when you forecast based on the historical, you do run into challenges. I think one really exciting development that we're starting to see now is in the area of agent-based models. And Oliver, this to a degree provides you some additional context around generation of data or synthetic data, where you actually look at using some fairly high-level rules and applying those to the system. And within the system, you'll have all of the elements represented as agents. And you just watch how those agents interact with each other. And what you actually generate is emerging behavior. Now, in terms of, is that emerging behavior right? You'll actually do what's called a retrospective, where you'll actually go and look at a historic case that you've seen in the system you're looking at, and you'll make sure that your agent model with its rules duplicates the patterns of behavior that you saw in that retrospective. And that gives you a level of confidence that you've got the system behaving correctly. And then you go and throw some different scenarios at it and see if there's any other emerging behavior that comes through. The look forward and the forecast in that sense does create some synthetic data that you can then go and apply some of your more traditional data analysis techniques to. But again, it's never going to be 100% accurate. And I think the key thing the key message from me is, if you get someone lobbing up on the desk saying that their forecasting is 100% accurate, certainly look to unpack that a little bit more. Because I think, we don't have that ability to look into the future. We can provide a level of confidence. We can do a lot of scenarios to help you map out responses to particular scenarios that will be robust and will be resistant to quite a few of the variables that change. But at the end of the day, we won't ever have that 100% confidence of that future outcome.
Yeah, and that's why we talk about, we use models or predictive models, and we use AI to enhance human performance, not to replace humans. Because it's in this environment, in a highly dynamic environment like the mining supply chain space, expecting an algorithm to absolutely replace every human being is quite utopical, to use a nice word.
Yeah, and I think the other elements around generative AI is the large language models that sit out there at the moment that are open for widespread use. Absolutely identify a lot of the patterns and are a really good start. There's a fair bit of work being done by organisations now through either having their own material and information, put into a large language model to generate their own version of ChatGPT for their organization to provide some more specific context. That can be quite expensive, requires a lot of data and a lot of compute power. One of the things we're seeing emerge, and certainly from a recent visit to the US, we were talking with Amazon around as well, is around prompt engineering, where through some targeted context setting in your prompts, you actually get to a much more relevant set of pattern searches, and you can really then start to make use of some of those widely available large language models, but get your industry specific and company specific context from those. So that's probably the key trend emerging now with generative AI and getting context for decision-making insights and models. So certainly happy to have further discussion away from this if that's an area you're interested in exploring.
You can tell us a bit about where you spent the last 3 weeks, actually.
No, look, so I think it's exciting to see some of the work that's happening in North America, and certainly talking to some of the AWS individuals around just the move in maturity of the digital twins through those stages where you get to that integrated approach, which is just broader than your organization. And I think Amazon are uniquely placed both from an internal perspective, but also externally with the large set of interfaces that they have. They're really starting to do some good work about, opening information up for all the stakeholders. I think mining companies have traditionally said, okay, we'll have the models for ourselves. So if you're a BHP or a Rio Tinto with a large supply chain, there are actually a lot of interfaces that are external to your organization. And historically, I think some of the information sharing across those interfaces has been fairly limited, but they are key inputs and have key impacts on your system. So being able to bring those into your supply chain and getting everybody onto the same platform and tool. So I think that's really where some of those integrated supply chains are going to come. So I think that's what we're going to see.
Oliver, thank you very much for that. But Oliver is saying thank you very much for that, but I was thinking more of a generative AI for tabular data. That is much harder to do, though, but can be very powerful.
I guess, Oliver, yes, we agree. It is more powerful, but you're right, it is much harder to do. So I think for us, that's where those agent-based approaches to generate that synthetic data for tabular data can come into it, but it's almost running the scenarios and then the back population of potential results. So that's fine. Maybe if we can, have you seen, Eduardo, from your perspective out and about, what are some of those leading automation solutions that you've seen deployed mainly in mining, or maybe you've seen some from other industries that you think could be applied to mining, or you've seen then tailored to deploy to mining?
From an
automation or data, or
so I think there is some space for the development of mining, and as well mining, each organization is completely different. But I would, if I could say something, I will reiterate what you mentioned, which is this siloed approach that happens sometimes. When you have siloed data, it's very hard to achieve a real integrated or holistic optimization. And without getting into the details of what specific algorithms you can use or not, I think that will be a great barrier, or a barrier to break, that will add a lot of value. Having said that, generally, you will see, if you want to go into more tactical automation algorithms that you use from either processing and almost everything, there's still a lot of traditional PNIDs, closed loop controls, which are not necessarily working in every. It's like we've got a hammer, so everything we see is a nail. So that's probably there's a level of maturity that in general, although as I said, there are differences in different mining organizations, but in general it could be a bit more sophisticated.
Yeah. And I think the other element around automation is you really want to make sure you understand what the problem is you're solving and where you want to get the automation in. The answer certainly isn't necessarily to automate everything. And certainly when you're looking at specific problems, you want to be very directed in terms of where you target that automation. I think an interesting example for me has always been the fleet management system for truck fleets in pits. I don't know how many of you had the experience of looking to implement the fleet management systems or operate them. But generally, in many cases, the automated allocation of trucks is disabled either by a controller sitting in a remote capital city that's of the view that they can allocate the trucks better, or by the supervisor sitting in his ute at the pit lookout, looking at the truck fleet moving in the pit, thinking that they can do better. So having that automated allocation may be, I guess, good in theory, but it comes back to that truth network and building up that truth network so that people actually have faith in those solutions. I think the challenge for a lot of people is that the individuals like to see an immediate reaction or an immediate benefit. A lot of the changes that you make in a supply chain at the front line, so changing the allocation of a truck or whatever, can have quite widespread ramifications across the supply chain that person who's making the decision at that point can't actually see. So part of the automation of that decision is actually understanding the wider ramifications of that through your supply chain, and therefore it becomes the right decision at that time for the system rather than the right decision perhaps for that local area. So it's really about how you get that message and ensure that you get that global optimization or that better result from the system rather than that local optimization where there's a vacancy under that shovel right now. I must get a truck there. And I think when you were only looking at the scoreboard for tons and cost, or tons, cost and quality, those decisions had much less of an impact. Now, as you start to see a lot of the other factors throughout the supply chain, especially in around the license to operate and the sustainability, the impact of a wrong decision is much greater. So it's really potentially moving more to protection of downside and risk management rather than chasing what might be quite a small upside.
Thank you, Alistair. So now let's move to the next phase, which is the process of leveraging automation in supply chain. So what's your view, right? So how do we do that given the current state of the mining industry?
Well, I think one of the big prizes people will chase is obviously maximizing performance against a lot of those KPIs. But in a lot of cases, your bottlenecks within your supply chain can move minute by minute. You don't necessarily want to respond to every little change. And I think in the old world where you planned and react, the moment something changed, you went and redid the plan. So I think it's about being able to step back and with better tools actually have more of an overview, and therefore you don't have to respond as much. So you're introducing less variability into the system. And I think the predict and respond element and the shift in the digital twins now to that predict and respond with the use of the predictive analytics really help with that, because they're really looking forward to and predicting what that system performance will be. And they're learning too. And the benefit of the machine learning and the deep learning and the neural networks and those elements is that you can learn from past predictions, and those get refined over time and get better and better. I think the other element coming in now, which is opening up a whole new range of things to look at, is how do you incorporate those human behavioural elements into it. So we all know that, you know, the best decisions of a tool can be undone by the impact of human behaviour. Someone, you know, a train driver doesn't turn up for a shift, so all of a sudden the train that was about to head out can no longer head out. You've got particular views. I know most of us will have been around close to the end of financial years or KPI years, and remarkably the goals change quite drastically there because certainly in the larger organisations, tons become everything. So everything gets deprioritised, chasing tonnage. So I think you've got a lot of those human behaviours, and they've always been there. They've always been impacting your systems. They've just been hidden in the averages of the data. And I think what some of the tools that are available now do is they make the human behaviour elements visible, so you can actually address those consciously. So it's an area that has been prevalent in healthcare and in health response. So certainly during COVID, a lot of the modelling techniques developed there around how humans would behave and humans respond, and looking at those, there's some really well-established tools, models, algorithms and techniques for that. And it's really now about looking at what insights can they provide about our large, complex, integrated supply chains to actually make an area that hasn't been visible, so you can actually start to make those conscious decisions. And then I think the other element there, and I've got it on the slide, is around data provenance being critical. As we become more reliant on data, and from Oliver's perspective, even when we're in synthetic data, understanding how that synthetic data was generated, what data was used for a particular run in a model or a tool to generate the recommendation or the insight, and then the impact of that insight back into the system becomes really, really important. Because if for example, if an organisation puts a tool in at a large mining organisation, and their recommendation from the mining company's perspective destroys a whole lot of value, I expect they're going to want some recourse. So being able to actually identify where the data came from, how that data flowed through the tool, is really going to become critical. So not only the data, but also the decisions, the recommendations. You're really going to need to be able to demonstrate, in the same way that you look at the physical flow of your ore through your supply chain, you're almost going to need to look at the way that the data travels through your decision supply chain to reach your recommendation and insight. So, you know, blockchain is one way that sort of provenance is being looked at, and that's certainly worked in the physical and virtual world as well. But I think looking at how that incorporates into some of these more advanced tools, you know, how a set of data generated a result from a generative AI. I think that the challenge of repeatability, if you type the same prompt into your generative AI tool 3 times in a row, do you get the same output? Now, often not, because you can actually go, didn't like this output much, go and generate a new one. So I think the repeatability of some of our newer tools is going to be a challenge for us as we look to implement some of the higher level thinking in our models.
Well, that was great. And now let's move to best practices. So so Oliver again, so Alistair. So I agree that the tools, algorithms, etc. are available, but there are still serious issues of drift as with AI ML models, and fine-tuning them fine-tuning them is non-trivial. I think the issues for consulting companies will be to verify the capability, not just for the algorithms to do the job, but an ability to update or fine-tune models on the fly. Yeah, I agree, Oliver, and we do a lot of that. So we don't only build the algorithms, but we help our clients fine-tuning them, because that's normally when you have, I agree, traditionally when you have more sophisticated algorithms, you cannot just drop the algorithm, give the algorithm to your client, and then they manage it. So we traditionally try to embed one team member of our client within our teams to make sure that they're across the ins and outs of the algorithms, and they are part of the process of fine-tuning them. Because otherwise, the flip side of this as well is you will have a complete dependency on a third party that you may want, but you may not want. So our approach at Adobe is trying to avoid that and empower our clients to own the algorithms that we co-create, really. But yeah, fine-tuning is you need to have experience at doing that if you want to do it properly and effectively.
And I think the other one, Oliver, that's certainly moving now is almost a live calibration of the digital twins. So it's getting the right data and feeding that through. It's really why data becomes absolutely critical, because the moment you put an algorithm in place for a forecast, almost the best thing you can guarantee is it won't be 100% accurate, but you want to make sure that the insights and the recommendations you get are robust. And I think that's the challenge. You're not looking for necessarily the one best result. If with small variation, you're suddenly going to dive into a valley of performance where you lose that efficiency. You're really looking to chase that plateau where you get a very good result that can put up with a lot of variability, especially with the complex systems and all of the interplays that you end up seeing there. So that's really one of the goals. And then that live ongoing calibration and rejigging to look at the drift. So I think there's certainly a lot of tools available to us around our data and analytics. So I think that data does just become absolutely critical. So one of the first exercises in any of these is really and in that discovery process, is around understanding the problem boundaries, understanding the data. So you're looking at the enterprise architecture and system map, you're looking at the data sources. You want to make sure that you understand, is it a data lake or a data swamp? What you're actually going to have to do to clean that data up. And I think one of the interesting approaches that helps cut through a lot of the additional data that you look at is almost to take the approach that they look at in terms of transmission of data from space and from the satellites up there. You often get really small time windows to be able to transmit the data. So what's the data you really need to get back to your core processing? So, to make sure that you're managing that drift. But, is there processing of the data and calculations and predictions and modeling you can actually do on the edge, locally on site, perhaps with more data coming back there, with less data then being transmitted back to your central tools. So some of that, there are certainly a lot of good options now that allow processing locally on the edge, and then transmission back into the cloud, where a lot of the current tools spend a lot of their time sitting, because that's really where you get your scalable, cost-effective calculations. So discovery then becomes a key. We've certainly seen good examples of data and data storage, but I think we'll find, and you all will have seen the examples of it, sometimes the only data you've got is is handwritten shift logs sitting on a table, and trying to get accurate data in from there is a challenge. So again, discovery is key. One of the other important elements from our perspective is the development of the solution in stages, because we've talked about that trust network. You know, great discovery process, go away for 3 months, come back and deliver you an all singing, all dancing model. No one's going to believe the results of that. It's working together with the mining company to actually develop that trust network, get the patterns recognized in small stages. So a lot of the work I've often found useful is actually to go down into the components and the modules within your supply chains, and only go down to the lowest level you need to. So there are some areas, if it's not a problem, you can have a nice high level driver model. But there'll be some areas where you want to go into discrete event modeling, or you want to go into a genetic algorithm type optimization. So it's really being able to pick the right tool for the right section of the supply chain. So that's really around the delivery of the solution in stages. And to get that faith that when you bolt the subcomponents together, I think that's the challenge there. And then I really still think the perishability and the provenance of data, decisions and insights is going to be important, because one of the elements is the decision that's right now won't be the decision that's right in 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes. So it's not like a decision just gets locked and loaded and can be taken at any time. So you've got to make sure that you understand what the expiry time of a decision is.
So from one of the attendees is asking, interested to know if there was any piece of information at the time that will make you decide not to derail based on the story, the initial story, and are there any tools that we've built ever since that could have helped you making a better decision?
Look, I think with that one, the piece of information that probably would have helped make the decision not to derail was absolute confidence that we weren't going to impact other trains or other parts of the system where people were exposed. So one of the other challenges of those rail networks is that there are public road crossings throughout the network. And in many cases, they're protected by boom gates that come down when they detect an approaching train at normal speed. Now, the train at the time we were looking to make the decision was traveling at twice the maximum speed limit for the track. So from that perspective, the potential interaction of the driverless train with members of the public, as well as with other trains as well, were the key drivers. I think the interesting point for me was the initial information we received wasn't only incomplete, it was actually inaccurate. So the system provided information about the speed of the train initially that didn't raise too much concern. So, the speed it was traveling at, it would come to a natural break or a natural stop, given the topography of the rail line. So initially it was it wasn't a relaxed discussion, but it wasn't sort of, this is going to need to go to that derail result. So I think the other thing is making sure that you've got more than one source of information for the critical elements of information around. So for the train initially, it would have been train speed. So we had really good information on the location of the train. We had really good information as to whether there was a driver on board or not. But that speed information wasn't accurate or complete. Had it been, I think we would have started thinking about the derailment decision earlier, and therefore it could have been more considered, and potentially the impact of that derailment could have been a lot less. It just in terms of production loss or equipment loss. The positive out of everything was it was still there was still no injury as a result of that. So so that's absolutely the key driver. But for me, it's understanding those critical failure points or those critical pieces of information for your major business risks, and making sure you've got some redundant sources of information for that, that can raise the issue as early as possible, because you want to make the decision as late as possible. So you really want to give yourself the longest amount of time to be able to make that decision. And at the end of the day, the decision was still relatively manual. There was no sort of system recommendation. So I think that probably also would have helped, because it was very much a plan and react, not a predict and respond. So again, I think it was still back in that there wasn't that level of tool to provide that insight.
And do you think something like automation on rails would help prevent this in the future?
I think that the processes you go through for the automation, and therefore a lot of the checks and the system interfaces that you have to look at to get to the point where you can, I guess, safely, autonomously run those trains, would have prevented, I think, some of those elements there. And if you've got a full fleet of autonomous trains, is there going to be a driver decision doesn't have to enter into it? I still think the public interaction is one of those challenges, but autonomous trains face that risk anyway, and have had to deal with that through sensors or cameras or however they deal with that. So to a degree, you've dealt with that risk as you've moved through to the automation journey as well. So yes, look, I think it would have been a little easier to make that decision in an autonomous world.
Thank you. So now let's well, we've been doing live Q&A, but now we open for anyone who has any questions or would like to share any stories or topics we haven't reached during this session. So please, I encourage every attendee to put something there, or if they have any queries or any interests that they would like further discuss.
I think one of the comments I'd like to make in the end is that technology won't solve every single problem. It's the right technology in the right place, and I think the range of problems that can now be solved, or the number of problems that have impacts on the large integrated systems, is now more widely recognized, and I think technology can certainly help with that. So, for example, on this slide we talk about mine dewatering. Historically, that's been very much it's, I just do that activity X weeks before I need to dig the hole. So I go and pump the water out and then I can mine. As we look for efficiencies, as we look for really fine-tuning the mining operations, and as we mine, as there's 4 companies mining within the same water system, there's a lot more complexity there, and there's a lot more potential cost-saving efficiencies and sustainability problems that can be addressed with an integrated approach using technology that help everybody solve the problem. So I think we're being able to move now to address more and more of the challenges that historically have been a little bit hard. So I think that's certainly a benefit there.
So Sean is asking, do you see technology being able to be generalized, or mining companies are going to need to all have large teams of AI engineers to make many fine-tuned specific systems for each unique problem? Good question. My view, I think it's a bit of both. I think you will have, and it will depend on how integrated you want to be. So I think there will be solutions that generalistic solutions are going to help, but there will be other which will be very specific to either ore type or the topology of your site, of your operations, that will need to be fine-tuned by AI professionals. I don't see the need of having large AI teams of large AI engineers, to be completely honest. As I was saying, well, I probably didn't say before, but for example, we solved a automation challenge recently, which was with an AI algorithm that tunes itself. So once it's set up for the first time, we leave site, and that algorithm is continuously self-tuning. So you don't need any team of people there. This algorithm is gonna be self-sufficient in a way, and the feedback has been outstanding. And this was to solve a specific train loadout challenge. So I don't believe all companies are gonna need large teams of AI engineers.
I think the other advantage is that there's a lot of organizations outside of mining that are doing a lot of work in the AI space as well. So a lot of the problems around tuning of algorithms, making sure that these things are still operating properly, looking at data issues, looking at cybersecurity, looking at a whole raft of those challenges. The large organizations like AWS and Microsoft and Google, and a lot of those organizations are actually solving a lot of those problems, or sort of solving 80 or 90% of the problem in a generic sense. And that last sort of 10% of organization specific or industry specific work is a lot less than having to solve the whole problem. So I agree with Eduardo. I don't think the organizations themselves are going to need to have large teams. They're certainly going to have people that understand how these tools operate. But I think in a lot of cases, you'll be able to actually have some really good partnerships with, specialist consulting type organizations, or organizations like AWS that are almost providing those tools as a service, rather than that sort of locally deployed solution that then requires a whole lot of support. Hopefully that answers the question, Sean. So, thank you everyone for attending this webinar, and thank you for your interventions as well. I think without that interactive Q&A, this will be boring, to be honest, not only for you guys, but for us too. So thank you everyone. And if you have any more questions, or if you want to discuss anything in the space of supply chain automation, please reach out. Please reach out at me or Alistair. We'll be more than happy to tell you what we're doing and disclose everything we can of the software that we're developing, and hopefully it will be able to help you in some shape or form. Yeah. So Alistair. Yeah, look, we're both on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out, and more than happy to answer any follow-up questions that any of you might have.
Thank you, everyone.